We're very blessed to have him today. Hugh, please.
Thank you very much. It's really a treat to be here today, and I'm quite honored to be invited to keynote your conference. I want to thank Bernie, and I recall when we met that we had an encounter. I didn't exactly remember the year. As I tell folks at my age, I still have a photographic memory. I just don't get same-day service anymore. So it was 2004. I want to thank and pay tribute to Bank of America right off the bat too. Just want to let you know Bank of America was a major partner with the National Urban League when I ran the organization. Your former CEO, Ken Lewis, served on our board of directors. He chaired our board and he propelled the vast expansion of our endowment. It was extraordinary contributions. And across the country, our Urban League affiliates partnered with Bank of America to help people buy first homes, to help them bolster their credit so they could qualify for mortgages. So a very special place in my heart and in the history of the Urban League for Bank of America. I want to salute the co-sponsors. It's inspiring to hear your remarks this morning and to chat with a few of you last night. The food security movement here in Connecticut and across the country through your sister organization provides an indispensable direct service to people, and you're also the conscience of our country in upholding America's noblest humanitarian traditions. So I hope that you see your work on the ground and at the inspirational altitude where you're working. It's extraordinary. You know, we're in an interesting time with the U.S. economy. There's no question that the economy is doing really well. This is welcome news. The strong recovery began under President Obama. It continues under President Trump. Let us not have any illusions about the arc of progress that we've made. The steady job creation is terrific. Middle-class income, I've read, is the highest since the onset of the Great Recession. Unemployment rates have plunged. Blue-collar workers are enjoying the best job gains since 1994. And unemployment rate for school dropouts has climbed from 15.6% in the summer of 2009 to 5.1% this summer. So we are making tremendous progress, and it is the dose of good news that this country needs. And Americans are feeling more confident about the economy and their place in it. That said, there are still some inconvenient truths about our booming economy. I'm going to throw some sobering statistics at you, so I hope you got a good night's sleep last night and can bear with me. The Census Bureau's national poverty rate declined to 12.3%, which is the lowest since 2006. That's the good news. The bad news is it's 12.3%. That's a lot of Americans. That's 39.7 million Americans are considered poor, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. The Trump administration claims there are only 250,000 people living in extreme poverty in this country. You serve over 400,000 people who line up for your food in this state alone. So something's wrong with somebody's calculus about poverty. Part of the difference is over whether the census counts non-cash support like food stamps and Medicaid. They've created a poverty rate which includes those factors that go into people's lives, but the reality is that however you measure it, the persistence and pervasiveness of poverty, despite the strong recovery, is an ugly picture no matter which lens we use. Now, you've gotten some information that Bernie has provided. Yesterday, when I went to the Connecticut Food Bank for the first time, I was expecting to drive up and find a little U-Haul truck, you know, a little abandoned warehouse or something that they were using. And there was this place twice the size of Home Depot where I'd been yesterday. I was dumbfounded. I must admit I was a little queasy when he took me into the freezer storage locker. I expected to find some humanoids from Westworld, or some corpses hanging on the hooks there, you know, like in the movies. So we left there very quickly. I pretended I was cold, but I really wanted to get out of there. But those statistics about food insecurity, which you know only too well, are very real. The proportion of Connecticut residents who are experiencing food insecurity has barely budged despite the boom. As Bernie mentioned, it's 12.2% of people in Connecticut. Perhaps the biggest shock is that it's still much higher than it was in 2007, and some 16%, or 1 out of 6 Connecticut children remain food insecure. On the income front, I've read that nearly half of American workers earn less than $30,000 a year, all across the country, recovery notwithstanding. 1 in 5 working mothers with small children hold low-wage jobs that typically pay about $10.50 an hour. As recently, Bernie told me, it's 2014, 49% of jobs in Connecticut paid less than $20 an hour, and 2/3 of those jobs paid less than $15 per hour. This means that more than 1/3 of Connecticut households still struggle to get by. I live next door in Westchester County. Day before yesterday, the United Way released a report. We like to think of ourselves as one of the wealthiest counties in the United States. We'll go toe-to-toe with Connecticut over, which is whether your state is wealthier than our county. 1/3 of families in Westchester County struggle to make ends meet despite holding down a job. They're unable to afford basic needs like housing, food, childcare, and transportation despite the recovery. 74% of households headed by single mothers and 64% of households headed by single fathers are under the threshold for economic survival in Westchester County. Much the same thing is true of single-parent households in Rockland and Putnam counties. On housing, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition said that there is nowhere in the country where someone working a full-time minimum wage job could afford to rent a modest 2-bedroom apartment. A 1-bedroom apartment is affordable at a minimum wage in only 22 counties in 5 states in the United States of America. And those are the states where the minimum wage is higher than $7.25 an hour. I've been trying to read some books about the nature of the economy and how it's impacting people. And one of them that I found arresting was called Squeezed: Why Our Families Can't Afford America. It's by Alyssa Quart. One chapter is on what she called the hyper-educated poor. I read about an adjunct professor who never earns more than $24,000 a year. She has no health insurance. She relies on food stamps and Medicaid for herself and her son. At least 28% of households that use food stamps as recently as 2013, 28% were headed by a person with at least some college education. The poverty doesn't discriminate, as you said earlier. Another book I read that's really interesting, it tells a lot of very inconvenient truths, and others know this having served on some corporate boards. It's a book by a labor historian from Cornell, whose name is Louis Hyman, and the book is called Temp: How American Work, American Business, and the American Dream Became Temporary. And he dates the profound shift in the job market back to the late 1960s at the time of stagnating profits. And back then, permanent employees, full-time employees, came to be seen as expensive. And cutting costs was easier for employers than raising revenue. So they began phasing out employees who were earning regular wages, steady, predictable hours, and health and vacation benefits, and instead phasing in independent contractors, day laborers, contract assemblers, consultants, temps, adjuncts, and freelancers. Also phased in a lot of technology. I mentioned I was at Home Depot yesterday morning. They don't have any checkout people there now at all. They have this really easy checkout computers or something. You just flash, scan, and you're gone. And so are the people who used to work as checkout. They don't have to pay overtime or benefits. They can shed workers quietly in a downturn without announcing embarrassing layoffs. According to Louis Hyman, the author of Temp, 94% of American jobs created between 2005 and 2015 were alternative work like this. 94%. This is our new economy. Despite the boom, there are pockets of astronomical unemployment. New York City's jobless rate is near about the national average, 4.1%. But in Brownsville section of Brooklyn, it's 14%. In University Heights and Fordham sections of the Bronx, it's 12.7%. It is a struggle to connect the unemployed in those neighborhoods with the jobs in other parts of greater New York. So we still have challenges. Thanks to the $1.5 trillion in cuts in taxes for corporations, I'm not hostile to corporations. I've served on a couple of boards, and I believe that private sector drives the economy of this country. But the reality is that thanks to that tax cut, stock buybacks are expected to reach a record $1 trillion this year. And corporate after-tax profits are up 16% in the quarter ended July 30th, fueled by economic growth, but also fueled by the sharp cut in corporate taxes. Yet wages in the past year increased by 2.7% from July to July, which sounds okay, but they were completely offset by increases in inflation of 2.9%. Now, what really shocked me was the average hourly wage increased 10 cents over a year ago. 10 cents. A 40-hour week, that's $4. Maybe that's a box of Wheaties. Maybe. I don't know that the workers who got 10 cents more are rejoicing today. So these are some inconvenient truths about our economy, which you know only too well. But when you stitch it all together, it's really rough out there despite what's going on. However, I'm old enough to have remembered how Lyndon Johnson declared war on poverty in the early 1960s. His declaration that we would end poverty in our lifetimes drew me into the anti-poverty movement, drew me into the work as a legal services lawyer representing people who could not afford lawyers in New Haven. And I believed him when he said that we as a nation will end poverty in our lifetimes. Then some years later, Ronald Reagan famously proclaimed that America had declared war on poverty and that poverty won. Echoing Reagan, House Republicans led by Congressman Paul Ryan issued a report in 2014 declaring that LBJ's war on poverty was a failure. Ryan asserted that poverty hadn't fallen and therefore we must slash spending on the poor because it's a waste of money. This summer, President Trump's Council on Economic Advisors started singing a very different tune. They issued a new report asserting that poverty is no longer a problem, that despite the Census Bureau finding that there are 39.7 million people who are poor, they claim that the vast majority of Americans are able to meet basic needs, that almost all Americans have access to housing and food, and therefore the war on poverty is largely over. So the war on poverty became a war against the war on poverty. Now we're headed into a war on poor people. That's the next stage. The justifications change, but the callousness toward the least among us remains the same. And what is the war on poor people? It's the beginning of a relentless assault on the social safety net. Republicans are targeting the safety net. They've been doing it for years. Paul Ryan's long-held agenda is to shrink the safety net by making most recipients, moving them from welfare to work, reducing what he calls the stubbornly high enrollment in welfare programs, and he claims that millions of Americans are in a tragic state of dependency on the welfare system. And you know how tragically dependent the folks are who line up your food banks every day. They're not tragically dependent. They are dealing with their reality, and you are there helping them. The most recent assault came this summer when the White House Council on Economic Advisors issued a new series of policy proclamations. They didn't call for benefit cuts yet, but instead they called for widespread and aggressive imposition of work requirements on recipients of Medicaid, food stamps, and rental housing assistance, all of them pillars of the social safety net. In June, the House Republicans, I'm not partisan, I'm just sharing what I read in the newspaper. Okay? So this is not fake news, this is ideological news, just what I read from the newspaper. The House Republicans released a proposed budget that called for deep cuts in Medicare and Medicaid. The House Budget Chairman, Steve Womack, Republican of Arkansas, issued a clarion call. The time is now for our Congress to step up and confront the biggest challenge to our society. There's not a bigger enemy on the domestic side than the debt and the deficits. Where the debt and the deficits came from, of course, is something you don't really focus on, but the tax cuts certainly help. The GOP recently called and raised itself by proposing a new set of tax cuts that would add $2 trillion more to the deficit. This is a clear expression of their priorities. The proposed new budget calls for $537 billion in cuts to Medicare and $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid. And those savings would come by shifting the program from an open-ended federal commitment to a capped system pegged to Medicaid medical inflation rates. Republicans in the House drafted a new food stamp proposal that was part of the Farm Bill that would require most adults to provide monthly proof that they are working or enrolled in at least 20 hours of workforce training per week. And those who cannot comply because they can't find a job or because they don't report could be locked out of the program for 3 years. Other Trump administration ideas, which I'm sure you know about, Bernie certainly did, that at one point they proposed replacing half of the food stamp benefits with food boxes delivered to recipients' front doors. I don't want to denigrate what you do, but you know that that's a step backwards. It's not a step in the right direction. Work requirements are interesting. You know, on paper they sound like they might make some sense, and people certainly ought to be trying to earn their own way. But the imposition of work requirements would require a vast expansion of a government bureaucracy, which this administration says that they want to shrink. Think of how many people would be required to oversee work requirements, to review all the paperwork, all the submissions. I read last week that in the Washington Post that over 4,000 people in Arkansas were tossed off of Medicaid just since the imposition of work requirements in June. People who receive Medicaid have to go online every month and report how many hours they work. Now that's fine if we're sitting here with our cell phones, but in one county in Arkansas where poverty is rampant, 3/4 of the people lack internet service or online access. They couldn't report in if they wanted to. The number of people who were dropped off of Medicaid in Arkansas is so large and so sudden that a nonpartisan federal advisory panel which oversees the program is alarmed. The chair said that the data are very concerning, very worrying. Another member said, I hope those data scare the pants off of people in Arkansas so they will pause and ask, what are they doing? When you have work requirements like this, there's a great risk of manipulation by understaffed, uncaring, incompetent, or callous bureaucracies that are hell-bent on pruning the rolls and saving the state's money. It's easy to lose or delay paperwork, make the paperwork really complicated, and disapprove people rampantly and force them to sue to get their benefits back. Another problem is the rigid application of rules without understanding the labor market realities of people who are receiving social safety net benefits. As was mentioned, their job lives are very volatile, very unpredictable. Another book I'm reading, which is really interesting, called Winners Take All, told the story of an employee who works at Nike, in one of the stores. The bosses keep her hours low so that they won't have to pay her health benefits. But they require her to remain available all week, which makes it impossible to get another job. So she might have trouble qualifying for continuing benefits. Kentucky planned to impose work requirements on Medicaid recipients, and before they were even implemented, the state acknowledged that probably about 95,000 people were going to lose their Medicaid benefits. Fortunately, in late June, a federal judge in Kentucky rejected the work requirements and ensuing cuts as inconsistent with the central objective of Medicaid, which is to help the states furnish medical assistance to its citizens. So the bottom line is that estimates are that millions of people will lose food stamp benefits if this goes forward. Now, I hope I'm wrong, but I worry that the work requirements are only the tip of the iceberg, that the first salvo aimed at deliberately unraveling the safety net for low-income and poor people in this country. In addition to work requirements, one of the companion Republican objectives is to utterly transform Medicaid by limiting per capita payments and turning it into a block grant program. Another ominous sign for the social safety net is a proposal by the Trump administration released in June to reshuffle the programs in a way that would make them easier to cut and scale back. They would shift food stamps from the Agriculture Department to a mega agency with welfare in its title. An aide to Budget Director Mulvaney said that the plan is a rallying cry for smaller government, which is why voters supported Trump. Reorganization is a key part of another emerging Republican strategy, and that is rebranding the safety net as welfare. Be very careful. This isn't just a matter of nomenclature. They issued a report called Expanding Work Requirements in Non-Cash Welfare Programs. Welfare, food stamps, Medicaid, housing assistance. They use that over and over again. And we must remember that we've seen this picture before. In the mid-90s, there was major welfare reform. What used to be known as aid to families with dependent children was rebranded as temporary assistance for needy families. But the key is that law imposed a 5-year lifetime limit on the receipt of those benefits. And it was championed by Democratic President Bill Clinton with bipartisan support. If they get away with rebranding food stamps, Medicaid, rental housing assistance, perhaps even earned income tax credits as welfare, then the longer range goal for those who are hell bent on shredding the safety net will not just be work requirements, it'll be time limits as well. And they could be lifetime time limits on food stamps, Medicaid, et cetera. That is my fear. According to Steve Bannon, the White House has provided cover for a small army of conservatives and think tank veterans who have been churning out dozens of initiatives, like the proposal to reshuffle the cabinet, with the ultimate goal of dismantling the American social welfare system from the inside out. With the ultimate goal of dismantling the social welfare system from the inside out. And the result, if that happens, it would leave low-wage workers and poor families at the mercy of temporary labor markets paying lousy wages with no health care, no way to afford decent housing and food, and no safety net to keep their heads above water. A safety net is just that. It is not temporary assistance or welfare. Medicaid was created to protect the health and well-being of families. According to LBJ, the food stamp was aimed at applying the power of America's new abundance to the task of building a better life for Americans. Food stamps, as recently as 2015, kept 3.8 million children out of poverty. The earned income tax credit and child tax credit lifted another 4.7 million children out of poverty. Now, there's another reality that we seldom acknowledge or understand, and that is that the safety net, and I mean no offense to anyone in the private sector, but the reality is the safety net indirectly but tangibly subsidizes the ability of employers to pay low wages to those who work for them. Because if that safety net didn't exist, the pressure on them to jack up the wages to a living level would be intense. But the safety net indirectly subsidizes all of us because we are happy when the cost of everyday goods and services doesn't escalate, which it might if there were no safety net and if employers were obliged to pay a living wage. So the safety net is indispensable not just to those who benefit directly from it, but it is baked into the way our economy works today. I read that many of Walmart's workers cannot survive on a full-time wage in the absence of safety net. And up to $6 billion annually goes from food stamps and other forms of support to workers in companies like Walmart. The same is true for Amazon workers. As many as 1 out of 3 Amazon employees in Arizona and 1 out of 10 in Pennsylvania and Ohio receive food stamps. Amazon says that they're part-time workers who prefer flexibility, but you gotta wonder, well, if you offer really decent paying full-time jobs and benefits, but people like the flexibility of working full-time with decent benefits as opposed to trying to cobble it together. For drivers in the much-hailed ride-hailing companies like Uber. 40% of those who drive for Uber in New York City have incomes so low they qualify for Medicaid. 20% of the drivers qualify for food stamps. And even as recently as 2013, 23,000 active duty troops in the US military used food stamps. So the safety net is supporting many, many employers. Nothing pernicious about it, it's just a stark reality. And if the safety net is time limited, rebranded as welfare and time limited, the damage it will do to families will be tremendous. And also the call to action by the private sector and all of us as consumers to understand it will be huge. And for decades, and certainly after World War II, America maintained and honored a social compact for its working people. And a core value of our country was to make America work for working people. But with the fundamental restructuring of the labor market and the emergence of a gig economy, the safety net is indispensable to making America work for working people in this day and age. It is deeply woven into the fabric of the economic lives of our country, of families, and of communities in the United States to prevent them from tumbling into destitution and their communities from tumbling into decay. The bottom line is the safety net enables workers who are earning lousy wages to provide minimally adequate quality of life for their families and for themselves. Imagine the social discontent and unrest if the safety net was shredded, the minimum wage remained minimal and unlivable, and workers' meager standards of living were to crater as a result. With a massive federal tax cut, the government gave away virtually the entire store to the wealthy and to corporations. And they now threaten to remove the crumbs that are left on the shelves of the poor. It's a national shame, and it's a national disgrace. But we must be vigilant, active, and engaged, and I know you are. We must call politicians to account for policies that imperil the economic well-being of working people and poor people. I enthusiastically endorse the agenda of the Connecticut Food Bank to grow your programs, to improve the quality of your programs, to protect major sources of support like food stamps, and to raise public awareness of the households that are benefiting and to advocate for a new policy agenda that will restore the social compact. We must educate, advocate, testify, march, and vote. We must protect and strengthen the social safety net from the ideological assault and from the burdensome requirements and draconian budget cuts. What makes America great, what makes our nation exceptional in our own eyes and in the eyes of the world isn't narrow-minded, mean-spiritedness, xenophobia, hostility, racism, white supremacy, and closed borders. What makes us great is our core values enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, our tolerance, our compassion, our openness to those with talent and drive, regardless of country of origin. And we all know that Native Americans were here first. As for the rest of us, we are a nation of immigrants, whether it's us or our ancestors. Many arrived as a matter of sheer willpower. Some, like my ancestors, came against their will. When President Trump famously disparaged African and Latino immigrants as coming from, pardon my French, shithole countries, he said it, I didn't say it. The truth is that most Americans or their ancestors fled what for them were hellacious countries and conditions. We forget that the Irish immigrated to this country to escape famine, the Italians to escape abject poverty, Jews to escape the Holocaust in Kristallnacht, Southeast Asians from wars and Eastern Europeans from oppressions behind the Iron Curtain. We all came on different boats, but we're all in the same boat now. And rather than driving irreconcilable wedges between us, we must recognize that America is a perpetual work in progress, and we're always striving to make our country a more perfect union. I read an op-ed in the New York Times earlier this year entitled, "Is Our Democracy Wobbly?" by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, who are the co-authors of a book called How Democracies Die. And in it they said that history suggests that democratic norms are vulnerable to polarization. Some polarization, they said, is healthy and even necessary, but extreme polarization can kill it. And when societies divide into partisan camps with profoundly different worldviews, and when those differences are viewed as existential and irreconcilable, political rivalry can devolve into partisan hatred. The lessons of history, they said, are clear. Extreme polarization can wreck even established democracies, and America is no exception. Let me close on a personal note. I was privileged to serve on the board of directors of the Mayo Clinic for 12 years, and one of the perks was getting my annual physical there. I spent a lot of time in waiting rooms there, and occasionally in emergency rooms and new walk-in clinics. And something profound dawned on me as I sat in the waiting rooms. The patients come from all walks of life. They are dressed up, they are dressed down. They come with ties, they come with tattoos. They come with floor shines and they come with no shines. The physicians, the nurses, the support staff are there, all ethnicities and points of origin. There are no signs of discomfort being around and being treated by quote unquote others. There are no red or blue, no conservative or liberal, oncologists, nurses, or receptionists. And we all in the waiting room and in those hospitals have two things in common at least. One is we all got to parade around those dumb gowns with the behind us exposed. We talk about a fashion trend waiting to happen. Somebody please invent a new gown. The second thing is that we are there and we have a common goal of preserving and restoring our health. The waiting room has much to teach and remind us all about what it means to be American and what it means to make America great. Exactly the same thing is true of the food security movement. There are no red or blue patrons or staff, no conservative or libertarian or liberal or progressive patrons who come for your help. They come from all races, young, middle-aged, and elderly, tattoos and clean shaven. All the beneficiaries are overwhelmingly stereotyped, as you mentioned, as minorities, immigrants, urban, but the perception, and there's a perception out there that the poor are slackers, takers, wastelers, malingerers, non-contributors, losers, scammers, shiftless, and unwilling to work. You know, you talk about fake news, you know that is not true. And just like the American population, the face of poverty is white, Asian, Black, Middle Eastern, Hispanic, every background one can imagine. So given the demographics of hunger, the food security sector represented here can play a vital role beyond feeding needy people every day. You can combat the stereotyping and polarization by relentlessly trumpeting your story to everyone and anyone and in any way who will listen and look. And therefore, I call upon you to call and raise your own efforts and to lead the effort to teach America how to be truly great by being true to our core values and our noblest traditions. Thank you so much, and again, I salute you.
Time do we have? Okay.
About 15 minutes.
Oh, good.
Do you have any?
Sorry to lay such a heavy message on you. We're all trying to figure out what's going on and why and what to do about it. And what you're doing is a huge part of what's going on in this country. There's a bigger agenda out there, and I view it's got to be stopped in its tracks now. Are there any questions?
And while you guys think about questions, we have a question theme today too. We have an incredible opportunity right now, being inspired by what Hugh just told us, and the people that we work with and that we know and that we speak with every day. We have an opportunity this afternoon to ask questions of both Lieutenant Governor candidate Susan Beischwitz and gubernatorial candidate Scribble. And we invite you to take a minute and write down questions. And while you're thinking about questions for Hugh, also think about questions for them. And when you are, during the break, if you want to hand those over to Miranda over there, we'll screen them and we'll have about 2 or 3 questions that we're going to ask them during the forum. And so hopefully that pause gave you a little bit of time to also think of questions for Hugh too. I think a lot of what you said was incredibly inspirational, and you know, I can kick off the questions since I'm standing here talking. You know, you talk about one of the things that really resonates with me is the rephrasing of the safety net programs, the nutrition programs, the healthcare programs as welfare. And I think that is an incredibly powerful way to stigmatize the programs that we know stimulate our economy, support our economy. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about if you have opinions on how can we, as advocates, reframe that conversation, because it's such a poignant and negative image that people have when you say welfare. How do we fight against that? How do we help turn the coin to the other position to really say these are economic drivers?
Well, a couple of simplistic responses. One, you're in the daily business of providing service to people. And you have relationships with key partners, and you may not, in some communities, rely on public support and government support. May or may not, or maybe it may generally probably. You want to be very strategic and careful not to put your enterprise at any risk in what is likely to become a real bare-knuckle political and ideological fight. But you also have boards. Your board members, in their lives outside of serving in the board, have tremendous leverage by definition of who they are. And they have the liberty, outside of wearing the Connecticut Food Bank cap on their heads at that moment, to be engaged in this struggle. So we often found at the League that our board members, and I'm not calling out any particular board members, but they were a tremendous asset. And so one of the things that you might think about doing is finding a way to engage and energize the boards to speak to public officials, elected officials, in very clear ways, not always by storming the public meeting, but in private. If the message from the private sector is leave the social safety net alone, that can be very powerful. So that's one thing I would do. I would look at mobilizing all of your assets, stretching your assets, your reputation, your image as far as you can, but also understanding there may be outer limits. But use all of your friends. And maybe create a Friends of Food Security movement, which is people who are not in operational responsibility, who have they're these 501c4, there are all sorts of organizations that can lobby, et cetera, that can be companions to what you're doing and can take the issue to another level in terms of engagement. That's one thing I think that you might consider doing, because I know you've got tremendous support out there, and the institutional and corporate partners need to be on board. I mean, there's a lot at stake here. That's why I call those inconvenient truths, but some of those measures, the changes could really impact the private sector, but the private sector's got to understand and support the importance of the social safety net. As I described it, they have a direct stake in this conversation as well. And if it is dismantled, they will feel the pain as well as the people who are cut off. It's already gone so long, but I think there's a tremendous asset to be engaged and tapped there. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah.
The basic income proposal that's been put out to provide every American with a basic income idea has been discussed. Ray Dalio, I think, just recently put out a set of numbers. What are your thoughts on that, and where do you think that proposal may go.
Well, first, interestingly enough, we need to give credit to former President Richard Nixon, who was one of the first people to propose something like that. He had a lot of flaws, but in many respects, some of his domestic ideas we were taking a little bit down. The key question there's several questions on basic income. The politics of it are really difficult to imagine, given the battle that's about to unfold. There are going to be efforts to scale back Medicare and Social Security for the elderly, not to mention the programs I talked about. How you introduce a conversation like a basic income, which is so utterly transformative into that stew, I don't know. The other question is, what's the level of the basic income? Is the basic income going to be enough to obviate the need for the social safety net? If it's up around $30,000 or $40,000 a year, that might do it. If it's $15,000 a year, it's still going to need food stamps, housing assistance, etc. The numbers I've seen around basic income don't remotely approach the amount needed to survive in this society. So I think it's a very complicated conversation. It will take decades to play out. I mean, so I just don't, in this environment, and for the foreseeable future, until people and politicians stop, and economies stop going crazy over the deficit, and either deal with it through some combination of trims in military spending, maybe domestic spending, but reversing some of the tax actions that were taken. I think that's the only way out. But it's going to take a differently composed Congress and president to do that. So I don't see the basic income. I think it's fine conceptually. I don't see it getting traction in this kind of environment. But that's just me. Yeah.
You mentioned in your speech the potential of polarization, the threat that it posed historically, as well as for us today. How do you see that playing out for us?
Who's us? Food stamp movement, or black folks? As Tonto once said to the Lone Ranger, what do you think we do about it?
For America in general.
I've seen various iterations of this. I grew up in segregation in Washington. I saw polarizing words that came out of George Wallace's mouth when he ran for president. I've seen tapes of Stokely Carmichael shrinking violet when it came to being polarizing. So we've been down this path before. What we have not seen, which I think is unusual, is that everybody's got a megaphone. Everybody can say what they want on Facebook, Instagram, whatever. So the noise level, the decibel level is higher and uglier. Some of the polarization is a function of whites being terrified of demographic change. That's not the way in this country, and some would say that this is the last stand as a majority, and they just can't handle it, just cannot handle it. So for me, that's what's behind the clampdown on immigration. You know, Trump said that Norway's okay, but all those black and brown countries are not okay. Really? So I think we're in a very difficult period. We should realize that it's not unique to the United States. This stuff is just as raw all over Western Europe. The populism is just as raw over there. So there's kind of a worldwide phenomenon of insecurity on the part of nations that have been, I don't want to say homogeneous, but dominated by one group, adjusting to change. That is rapidly changing in this country. And it will continue to change despite the efforts to resist it. But just look all over Austria, Sweden, Hungary. It's really ugly out there, so we're not alone. And I think it'll change if we get a different tone from the top, as we used to say in corporate America. We've got a president who's fanning it now. Before that, we had a president who did everything but fanned it to try to calm the waters. Maybe a calming, unifying president the next time around will change. Maybe a different Congress will make different, transmit different signals. But most importantly, it's got to come from the ground up, and that's the power of what you do. It's got to come from the ground up. When I was growing up in Washington, D.C., I belonged to the Unitarian Church. And when we were in Sunday school, once a month, we either visited a Sunday school in a church of a different denomination, whether it was Hindu or Jewish or Catholic. And then once a month, the kids from another Sunday school would come visit us. And then we would debrief on the experience. It was powerful. I grew up with hardly, and I'm not patting myself, without hardly any sense of, well, those people are this and those people are that. It just wasn't part of the way I looked at the world. So I think that the community organizations, and particularly, and I'm not saying because you're part of faith, I think the faith community can do a tremendous amount of work. You can build on what you do through the food security movement to broaden your outreach to other churches, for example, that are involved, and get the young people connected. Let them discover one another again. Let them discover their commonality. Let them discover they dream about the same things. They have different needs, different realities. But that experience, I have never forgotten that experience from Sunday school. And I think that can be, it can lay the foundation just to set a very different tone in this country. That's going to take some time. But those are ways in which your movement can capitalize on and leverage the extraordinary credibility that you have.
Go ahead, you got a question behind you?
Sure.
Hi, thank you, good morning.
Uh-huh.
You know, a lot of the change that, well, first of all, I'll say a lot of the social safety net programs we'd like to maintain, or the change that we'd like to see is really dependent upon legislation, you know, regulations, allocation of funds that comes through a legislative process, ultimately dependent upon voters. And in the state of Connecticut, you know, we might have in some of our richer towns a voting rate as high as maybe 30%. In some of the urban centers and lower income towns, it might be 10%, 12%. So can you talk to us a little bit more about perhaps turning our eye toward the private sector? If all of this money, tax cuts, incentives have been moved to the private sector, and the private sector is experiencing incredible growth, they have capital, what is the message to the private sector? In other words, if we look at another process instead of the legislative process, which is slow and rather dependent upon what people want to say to get elected or to stay in their position, how do we engage the private sector? What's the messaging? What's the language barrier? What do nonprofits and other organizations like us need to do?
Well, let me start by taking a little exception to what you said about the sluggishness of decisions in the public sector. Depending on, I'm going to get political, depending on the outcome in November, if a Congress which endorses dismantling the safety net is elected and Trump is still in office, they can start working on this in January. That change can come really fast, just like the tax cuts came, whoosh. So let's not think that dismantling the social safety net, regrounding it, time limiting it, cutting it, is necessarily a long-term agenda. I think we need to have open conversations and honest conversations with the private sector about their stake in the safety net. And their stake is moral, but it's also economic. The safety net is now, as I said, an indispensable part of the way the economy functions. It enables them to maintain the kind of labor force that they do. I don't like that, but it is in their self-interest that the safety net remains strong. So I think that they should be partners and should be sending clear messages to Congress about don't unravel the safety net. And that's where I think your boards who often have those kinds of connections can be very, very powerful. This is not necessarily a slow walk to change. That's the main point I'm trying to make. Let us not have any illusion. The rebranding is happening now. The tucking of these programs underneath those new brands is happening now. And so we all have to engage. And we've got to get out. Make a political statement. People have got to get out and vote. There's an opportunity to be heard in 6 weeks. This is huge. what's going on right now is huge. And you'll feel it. Your movement will feel it. If the safety net is cut, the demand for your services will increase exponentially, which will put a tremendous strain on all of your supporters. The supermarkets are going to be expected to do more. Corporate partners are going to be expected to do more, contribute more, volunteer more. Everyone has a stake in this outcome. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.